Welcome back to Control the Freak. Today we're going to look at the control freak origin equation, which is event, drive, permission. So, sorry, there's been a couple of week gap. The first week I was really poorly. I had to take a week off work with that. And then last week we were dog sitting for the weekend. And I've said before that dogs and kids are my favourite thing, so I wasn't going to turn down that opportunity. Anyway, back into it now. As I said, we're going to look at the control freak origin equation, which is event, drive, and permission. And to do that, I'm going to tell you a couple of stories first about some people I knew. I've said before that I grew up in a rough area and I spent some time with some pretty rough people, some pretty dangerous people, actually. These two weren't kind of up there in the dangerous stakes, but they were pretty bad people. I'm going to tell you their story and I'm going to explain why I've told you their story. So the first story is about a guy that I remember first seeing him pointed out across the playground when I was very young. I must have been around 7 years old, and he would have been about 10, maybe 11, just about to move up to high school. And somebody said his name, and everybody turned to look because everybody else knew who he was. And I looked across the playground, and I see this guy, and you could tell there was an aura about this guy straight away, even at that age. Most people were keeping a distance from him, apart from a couple of little hangers-on. And he kind of carried himself with a real arrogance. There was a bit of an air of violence about him even then. I remember seeing him, just as I kind of recognised that violent air about him, I remember seeing him going and hitting a kid. Dinner lady comes across the playground and she tries to kind of placate him and calm him down. But I noticed even then that the dinner lady even was quite nervous of this guy. She was keeping her distance and she was saying really nicely, please don't do that. And this dinner lady was particularly harsh. I mean, I got in trouble with her a few times and she didn't pull her punches. In fact, I got a slap across the head from her one time. It was a different era back then. Teachers and dinner ladies could slap you across the head every now and again. And she's certainly done that to me, but she kept her distance from this kid and she seemed very, very nervous of him. I saw him around a little bit more after that, but then he disappeared off to high school. But I was hearing more and more stories about him. He was escalating in his violence. He was beating a lot of people up. And he was already getting a reputation for being able to knock people out with one punch. At this age, he must have been sort of 12, 13. And his reputation was getting bigger and bigger. I then moved up to high school a few years later, and again by that time he was almost ready to leave high school, and his reputation was quite legendary then, not only in our sort of small town, but they were starting to hear about him in other towns as this kind of terrifying character. By the time I left school, that's when I was really starting to hang around with a lot of naughty people. I had my own little group, and we kind of weren't like that. We had our moments, but this other group were involved in a lot worse stuff. And I would move around groups a few times, and every now and again I'd move into this group that he was kind of on the periphery of. And you'd hear more stories about him. Again, lots of violence, lots of random attacks on people. And you were starting to hear about how he was treating his girlfriends. Apparently he was knocking his girlfriends about a bit as well. But he'd kind of throw them to the wayside. They'd do something that upset him. He'd knock them about. Then he'd just move on. There'd be another girl. And there was a steady stream of girls that were interested in this guy. It's quite odd, isn't it, that you get people like this, bad boys, that some girls just gravitate towards. It helped that he was really well presented. He was quite a handsome kid, and he always dressed really, really nicely. He always had the best clothes, and it always looked like he came from money. And he kind of had that air of respectability about him, but on the other side, he was really, really violent. And I'd see him every now and again around about the town, and he'd always have his kind of nose up in the air and his shoulders back, and he kind of looked down on everybody. There was a couple of times he paid a bit of attention to me, and I thought he was going to hit me a couple of times, just randomly. He was eyeing me up, and I thought, oh, he's going to hit me now. And you kind of brace yourself for it, but he never did. I think he just enjoyed trying to intimidate me. It's what he was like with everybody. He was a big lad as well. I get into my sort of late teens, he's in his early 20s, and there was a story about him. It was in the newspapers, and I think he ended up going to prison, or some other people were involved went to prison, where they had a fight in Cleethorpes, which was the place down the road from us that had lots of nightclubs. And they'd had a fight on the pier, Cleethorpes Pier, and he ended up throwing somebody off the pier into the Humber River. I think the kid survived, but he was really, really badly injured. In fact, I remember now this guy went on the run. A load of the people that he was with went to prison, but he went on the run. While they're in prison, this guy slowly filters back into town, and now he's got the run of the place because a lot of the other tougher guys were kind of out of the way. So now he's got the run of the place, and he's lording it over everybody. He would walk into a pub and it would fall silent, apart from one night. He walks into the pub and one of my friend's dads was on the door. Now, my friend's dad's reputation was legendary, and it wasn't just in our small town or in our kind of little area. This guy had a reputation that went for miles around. Terrifying, terrifying character. Thankfully, he liked me. I got on really well with him. But he was one of those guys that was just a league above. You get people that can fight, and then you get people that are just unbeatable. And that's what this guy was. Now, a year or two before, this young lad that I'm talking about had beat up this guy's son. Now, the bouncer guy that I mentioned just now, he didn't want to just go and beat him up because he'd beat his son up. He kind of wanted his son to stick up for himself. But he had it in his head all this time that one of these days I'm going to get you back for what you've done to my son. Something happened in the pub that night. It kicked off to some degree, and this guy, this bouncer guy, has gone to get this young lad, but he's legged it. He's legged it out of the pub. He's realised, I'm up against it here. I can't possibly beat this dude. But again, he didn't know what he was up against with this guy. This guy, as lovely as he was, kind of almost bordered on psychopathic. Once he decided he was going to get you, he was going to get you. So he went back to this young lad's house, broke in, and sat in the dark waiting for him to come home. This lad obviously must have been a bit brighter than his actions would have led you to believe. He didn't go home that night. In fact, he disappeared to a couple of towns over. And so my mate's dad kind of gave up and thought, right, I'll just wait for him to come back. I'll get him. In the meantime, this guy's moved a couple of towns over, and it wasn't long before he was playing up again, starting to try and make his stamp in that little town. He goes along to a pub door, and he goes to push past the bouncer to get in, and the bouncer kind of stops him, and this lad goes, do you know who I am? And as soon as he's kind of uttered those words, this bouncer has hit him in the stomach so hard, this kid's wet himself, and he's dropped to the ground, and the bouncer's left him in a heap. And as he looks through the door, this guy picks himself up and kind of staggers off into the distance. As luck would have it, this bouncer knew my friend's dad, the bouncer, and he was telling him the story. And my friend's dad put two and two together and went, was his name so-and-so? And he went, yeah, I heard afterwards his name was so-and-so. And my friend's dad, who knew violence intimately, said, he's going to be back. Watch him. He's going to come back and he's going to try and make friends with you to drop your guard. And then he's going to have another go. And this other bouncer laughed it off, going, nah, I sorted him out. He's not coming back. 2 weeks later, this kid rocks up at the door and he's all apologies. I'm really, really sorry. I'm new in town. I'm trying to make friends. I was a bit nervous. Will you accept my apology? And the bouncer kind of wearily said, yeah, all right then. He shook his hand. And then every weekend, this kid would come to the pub. He'd get a beer and he'd stand outside talking to the bouncer. And they got on really, really well. And the bouncer started to think, God, I had this kid wrong. I probably shouldn't have hit him. And then one night, this kid's talking to the bouncer and he turns as if to look into the car park because he thinks as if something's going on there. And as the bouncer followed his eyes, this kid spun round and he's gone for a hook to the jaw. But the bouncer, being a little bit more experienced in violence, has managed to slip the punch. And then he's done this kid, and he's done him properly this time. He's absolutely caned him round the car park and left him in a heap. This kid's eventually picked himself up, staggered off into the night. A year or two later, this guy comes back to my little town. A lot of time has passed by then. People didn't know it was him to start with, because as I said before, he was always this kind of well-dressed, nose in the air, shoulders back, arrogant character. But somebody spotted him sat in the corner of the pub nursing a pint on his own, and he usually had a load of hangers-on. But he sat in the corner, he's quite scruffy, he's unshaven and what have you, and he's just very quietly having a drink. And then someone else heard that he was doing it again in another pub. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He was just very quietly nursing his drink, and at the end of the night, he'd slip off home. That's the first character. We'll come back to him in a moment. There's another one that was a similar kind of character, and they hung around kind of in the same group. But while the first guy was a little bit more popular, if only through fear, this guy wasn't even really liked in his own group. He was such a disagreeable character. Now, the first time I heard about him was when my sister told me that she fancied some guy and she said his name. I'd never heard of him, and I mentioned him to one of my older friends, and they said, yeah, he's so-and-so, and they told me a bit about him. He likes fighting, he's always in trouble with the police, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, oh, God, this is the guy my sister fancies. I really hope she doesn't get with him and bring that home. But this guy was kind of aloof anyway. He wouldn't have given my sister a second look because she wouldn't have been cool enough for him. So I started to hang around this guy later on, and he was very choosy who he would talk to. He would hang around on the periphery of the group, and he would talk to one or two people, and he would sneer at everybody else, literally sneer. He'd kind of curl his lip up and just kind of look you up and down. Everybody, unless the couple of people that he decided he was going to talk to. Incredibly arrogant, kind of malevolent character about this guy, that he was just, you could smell violence on him. One night, we're at the pub, and there was an old pub landlord that we'd heard about, and I got on all right with him. You got the impression that he didn't take any shit, this dude. He was a nice enough fella, but he wouldn't take any crap. And we knew that he was an ex-boxer. I thought he was a nice guy. But anyway, it was a Thursday night outside our local, and Thursday nights were the big night at our local. In fact, it was so good in there that people would come from other villages to our little town that was kind of in the arse end of nowhere, that had a bit of a kind of rough reputation. Thursday nights were so good, everybody would pile over there. It was like a little nightclub, this little pub. So it's heaving anyway, and not everybody can get inside. And the cooler lads, the naughty lads, would hang around on the door, kind of intimidating people as they walked past, trying to kind of stamp their authority on the area to the strangers that were coming in. The landlord, every now and again, is going out through the back door and he's telling people, can you get inside? I don't want drinks outside. And every now and again, he's picking up empty pint glasses that people have just left in the car park, and he's kind of getting the ump about it a little bit. Picks up a load of glasses. He's got an armful of glasses. He can barely carry them all. And he tries to get himself through the back door. And he's managed to kind of hook a finger into the door handle and pull it open. But this kid stood there in the way of this door and he won't move. And he's just kind of sneering, looking the pub landlord up and down. And the pub landlord has accidentally nudged him with the door, and he's gone, oh, sorry, mate, like that. And as soon as he said that, this young lad's gone, you will be. I've never seen an attack so quick in my life. Literally, as soon as he said the words, you will be, this landlord just let go of everything in his arm, 3 headbutts in a row, bang, 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 like a machine gun, bang, bang, bang. And this guy's kind of staggered off the step, and then the landlord has just followed him, bang, 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 until he's on the floor. And then when he's on the floor, he's grabbed him by the hair and he's just windmilling him in his face. And you could just see this kid's face just deteriorating with every punch, like blood and his face changing shape. He was absolutely mullering this kid. Nobody came to help this kid, even all of his cool mates who were really into fighting and what have you. Nobody came to help him. They all just stood there, which was quite telling about what this character was like. Because I know if it was one or two of the others, they'd have all swarmed this landlord, but everybody stood back. Left him in a heap, goes off into the pub, and everybody's kind of just watching this guy. And after a few minutes, he's kind of got conscious enough to pull himself up and stagger off into the night. And he was never heard from again. Now, this was a guy that would kind of insert himself into every social situation. He'd gate crash parties. If you were sat in a group at a pub, he'd come and kind of barge his way in and be really obnoxious about being the centre of attention. But he staggered off into the night and nobody ever heard from him again. So why do I tell this story? This is a channel about controlling behaviour, after all. So why would I tell this story? Because it looks like these guys had no control whatsoever and certainly didn't seem interested in it, apart from the obvious having control over people with violence and intimidation. Well, that's because afterwards I heard the story of both of these guys, and that's why I wanted to revisit the event, drive and permission equation. So let's start with the first guy. His story was that he was absolutely dominated in the home as a child, both mentally and physically. In fact, his dad was described to me as being a brute. That's the word this person used, because this guy's dad knew this other kid's dad. So he knew his whole story. He'd been round the house and he'd watched what the dad had done to him and his sister and his wife. This guy had absolute domination of his house. The reason this kid was so well dressed was because that was the image the dad wanted to project of this family. The mum was always immaculate, the daughter was always immaculate, and it was all about how the family looked. And inside the house, that was enforced with violence, intimidation, and coercion all of the time. The dad was an absolute animal. And this is a long-term event. Remember, events can come in two forms. There can be a sudden high-impact event where something hits you so hard it changes you forever, or it can be a long-term influence event. And I've mentioned before that can be parents, siblings, somebody you work with who over time is such a coercive force on you, they change the way you are. And that's what his dad was with him. He was absolutely dominating with him. He was his event. The drive, after that, as I say, the drive is usually to regain or obtain the control that you've lost or never had. Well, the drive in this case came in two forms. The drive was to keep control because that's what his dad wanted him to do. His dad sent him out to be violent. You've got to be the hardest kid. You've got to fight everybody. Which kind of explains why this guy was always on the attack. He was being told to do this by his dad. But he would have also gained something from that. He would have gained some satisfaction from having control over people when he didn't have it at home. This guy couldn't put a foot right at home. He was absolutely dominated. And now here he is, through violence and intimidation, gaining some kind of comfort from that. And that's going to drive that forward. Even without the dad pushing him to do it, the comfort and confirmation would have been really intoxicating for him. That's what drives controlling people, the confirmation that you get from gaining control. And then permission, the final part of the equation, is that everybody let him do it, even when he was really young. Remember, I said that there was that dinner lady who should have gone in to this young lad and accosted him for hitting this other kid, and he should have gone through some kind of punishment system. But the dinner lady stands back, shows that she's nervous, which gives this guy permission to carry on. And then throughout, teachers were the same. Teachers would never confront this kid. They were all scared of him. Police would never confront this kid. I remember seeing him one time in our local shopping centre where we always hung around getting drunk. And him and his mates would always take things to another level, smashing windows and hurting people. The police would turn up and they'd get hold of the other lads. Nobody ever went for him. All the while, this is giving this kid permission to carry on. He's getting away with it. Nobody is putting a full stop to it. It's funny that he only changed when permission was violently withheld or pulled back. Once he met with somebody who wasn't going to give him permission to act that way, that's when he stopped. Now, it took two times. It took two bouncers to do it. And sometimes when somebody's gone too far down that path, it will take a couple of high-impact events to change the way you are. And luckily, I say luckily because I agree with what they did, these two guys were really high impact events for him and they stopped him dead in his tracks. So again, the only way you're going to change this behaviour is to withhold permission. If it had been withheld much earlier by the dinner ladies and the teachers, he probably wouldn't have gone on to be as bad as he was. But he ended up being bad into his early 20s because he was getting permission all of the time. And all the time he's getting permission, that drive is getting stronger because there's a much bigger reward because there's bigger and badder people that he's dominating who are now kind of giving him permission to carry on. So again, that's the event drive permission cycle with this young lad. If I look at the other guy, really similar story. Again, I didn't know this at the time, but I found out afterwards, once he kind of disappeared and people were talking about him, he had another brutal parent. I think it was a step parent. Up until sort of late 9 or 10 years old into his early 11, 12 years old, he'd had a step parent in the house who again was brutal. He was a heavy drinker and he used to knock this kid and his brother about and apparently lock them outside in the cold and things like that. He was a really, really horrible person. And he disappeared out of their life when they were around 10, 11 years old, and then he would periodically come back in and unsettle things. The mum had no control. She was absolutely beaten down by this stepdad. So once the stepdad was out of the way and this mum is a bit of a kind of quivering wreck because she's had to live with this guy, the two kids then step up. So they've had the high impact event or the long-term influence event of this brutal step parent. And then when he's out of the way, there's no control from the parent at all, from the mother. She's just now kind of very meek and keeps herself to herself. So the drive is going to be to kind of reinstall some kind of order, because believe it or not, kids thrive on order. And if you don't give them the right order, they're going to create their own. So they started to dominate the house and dominate the mum. They're getting away with it. Then you've got the drive and the permission. So outside of the house, they continue to get permission, because in all the times I saw this guy act like an absolute dick, nobody pulled him up on it. Lots of them would slag him off behind his back, and a few of those lads could have easily taken him, but they would never deal with it. They would just kind of let him get on with it and watch him abuse and bully younger people, and sometimes find it funny. So it was into his kind of late teens, early 20s, he carried on with this permission. Apparently he got arrested a couple of times. Nothing ever came of it, so he's got away with it. He's got permission to carry on. Right up until he meets the pub landlord, who basically wipes the car park with him and leaves him in a bloody heap. Now, this guy was already so insecure, which was a lot of the behaviour that drove the bullying, because he was a very insecure guy underneath it all, although it would take some looking to find that. That once he's been so humiliated in front of his friends and had permission withdrawn so violently, that's the only thing that stopped him, because it was such a change in his status. He went from being reasonably high status to being a lump of blood and skin on the floor of this car park. And for him, there was no coming back from that, because he was already so insecure. The other guy was quite secure in himself to some degree, because he was much better at violence. So it took 2 attempts to withdraw that permission. With this kid, it only took 1. So I think these stories basically highlight a way to understand the event drive permission cycle. You start with an event, whether it's a high impact or long-term influence event. This creates a drive to regain or obtain control that you've either lost or never had. And then you're allowed to carry on. People give you permission, and that just perpetuates the cycle. You've got to learn where to step in and withdraw permission. And the thing is, you've got to do that as early as possible. And that's not about being controlling. That's about not letting somebody else control you, who does have bad motives to do so. And I think we could have probably saved these kids. I say this because I've mentioned before that I would like to go into prisons to talk to violent offenders, particularly abusive violent offenders that have hurt their partners, to try and dig down into their event. And if I can get them to understand this cycle and see how it's led to where they are, half the battle is understanding it, and then you can do something about it. So I'd like to do that. But I'd also like to go into schools and talk to young people. Again, imagine if somebody could have gone hold of these young lads when they were sort of 12, 13 and identified to them the cycle that they were following and the prediction of where it's going to go. You might be able to do something about it. So that's what I'd like to do. And that's why I thought I'd share these stories with you. They're really simple, black and white stories that highlight the event drive permission cycle. I'll leave that there for you. If you've got any questions, if you've got any problems, if you want some advice or what have you, stick it all down here where my missus very helpfully puts all of that kind of stuff. In the meantime, I'll leave you with the usual. Control the freak, not the people. I'll see you next time. Behave.